All right, everybody. Let's get through this last major lecture, and then we're just going to get to the optionals and really to the tasks in the next one. But in this one, we're going to talk about the Masculinities and Globalization article. And this one's kind of key to really understanding, again, that change, and that we're not just talking about change within this identity of woman, this identity of femininity, this identity of, as we get into trans or non-binary or those kind of categories, as we start talking about those, that we're also going to be talking about masculinity, that we're also going to be talking about these frameworks for understanding this, right? And I think this is a really good depiction of how masculinity and how gender itself changes across time, space, cultural, how these variations impact really this understanding that this is a social structure, like this is something that this is something that we have built as a society, and it's something that we consistently change to meet whatever needs it is that the culture or society has. Okay, so again, time, space, power dynamics, needs of the society. This is something that this touches on really good. I'm going to define a couple things. Defining plural masculinities is just this idea, again, that we have multiple different ways to be masculine, that masculine doesn't necessarily isn't performed in one singular fashion, that context isn't a matter, and that any one person can project multiple different kinds of masculinity depending on the space that they are in or how they are operating. And that's kind of the difference between the roles we're in, right? And that impact based on whether we're being viewed at a macro level, whether it be having interpersonal interactions with someone, and what those masculinities look like and how they balance and play off each other's. Also, it understands that there are multiple different ways to be masculine or multiple different ways to identify and personify and embody male. And that happens throughout all of life, right? Okay, so we look at male leading figures today. That's going to look very differently than maybe George Washington and his wig, right? Okay, so that's going to look very differently. Or if you look at maybe like a Scottish man and his kilt, or you're going to look at maybe um, maybe someone in Africa or in a tribe, a male dominant masculinity personality in Africa who may be wearing a very different cultural understanding of what the dress looks like, what embodying male looks like, right? The haircuts are going to be different. The framework for how we, whether or not we put makeup on our face, whether or not we put any kind of paint on our face, whether or not we are dressing in a particular way. All of these things change and vary, and it doesn't necessarily mean that any of these masculinities are wrong in their ability. It does, however, have social structures for which, depending on where you are, have a hierarchy of expressing of power dynamics, right? And that's kind of where we get into hegemonic masculinity. The hegemonic masculinity that we talk about here in America is really that very buff, hyper, stoic with maybe their emotions, is straight, is married, has 2.5 kids, has a wife, is the leader of the household, is the dominant economic funds of the household, like all of these things, right? And we can kind of, I could get on a, if I was in class, we would have this fun little game where we would essentially figure out, like we would write down all the categories or all the traits that we attribute to a specific gender, and we talk about how each of those genders can have most of these traits, right? And kind of why that's important. But because we're not in class, we're gonna roll with me on this, okay? I'm just gonna give you examples and we're gonna talk through them. We're also going to talk about collective masculinity, and that's just the idea that when someone is in a particular place, they're going to act like the rest of the other individuals in that space, right? So, like, think of collective masculinity when we're talking about, like, maybe a sports team, right? The guys on that sports team are possibly going to interact with each other in very similar ways that they may not interact or may not be outside of that arena of that sport, right? And that's that idea that you have a collective conscious, right? Like, so you're going to go in, you're going to perform this activity in this way with this performative masculine action, and that's going to do so in a way to show that I'm a collective part of this masculine group. Does that make sense? And then again, we're going to talk about hierarchy. It's just that where you are in that power structure. Are you the one creating that power structure, or are you the one that maybe is more marginalized? Are you somewhere in between? Does that jump? Does that ladder move? Where is that power dynamics? How are they impacting you? Okay. Remember that any of these masculinities and any form of masculinity can be resistance to or a contradiction of that hegemonic idea, right? Okay. So this idea of that maybe more modern man with maybe longer hair, maybe up in a man bun. Maybe he's wearing his briefcase satchel that looks very different than the standard one you carry. Maybe he's operating or running a bookstore. Maybe he's, you know what I mean? Like this idea that this hegemonic masculinity can be intentionally pushed back upon. I remember when men started wearing skinny jeans because I'm a little older, right? Like the idea that a man would put on a skinny jean was like the end of the world for a while. And then everybody's like, all right, whatever, you do you, right? But that resistance and that ability to change what is acceptable within that category of masculine is there intentionally, right? And okay, and I mean, think about 80s hair bands, okay, for an example. You want to talk about the differences between resistance, masculinity. 80s hair bands were resistance in a few of this idea of this long hair, the makeup on their face, the hyper dramatic, hyper tight leather bands, right? Like 80s hair bands are the perfect example of a masculinity that was widely accepted at the time, widely embodied and embraced, what was very against the dominant idea of what hegemonic masculinity was at the time. And that's okay, right? That resistance and that ability to contradict that shows that, again, that hegemonic masculinity doesn't mean that it's the majority of masculine identities. It's the one that has the most power or has this power structure. And she has different models of masculinities within this and how they've kind of changed. This idea that conquest and settlement, like those explorers, the people that had the money to do the exploring, those feudal leaders, like these kind of ideas really started to embody what that hegemonic idea was and how that has shifted. And then we went into more empire building. So like it became, hey, we have this group, we have this power base, we have conquested and settled all these different regions. We're going to start into capitalism and we're going to start racking up that money, right? This is what we're trying to do. And then we get into that post-colonialism and really, okay, so now we have annihilated multiple other forms of masculinity, multiple other forms of culture, multiple other variations of what and how we do life. And now we're in this neoliberal idea of what masculinity is. Maybe it's a little less violent on this war-based idea or this conquering or this empire building, but maybe it's more centered on like business, more centered on that idea. And that kind of moves us into this transnational business model where it's like, no, this businessman that collects multitudes of wealth. It's the Elon Musks of the world. It's the Donald Trumps of the world. It's where we have epitomized men and manliness with wealth. And that doesn't mean they have the same body type as we usually put in that hegemonic male category, but there's like certain brashness or harshness or still these things, but they're seen as this good way. They're moving up the business ladder. They're moving up this way. They're being a boss. They're doing this, right? They're whatever it is. And these are just examples of this transnational businessman model that seems to be that hegemonic idea now. That doesn't mean that that's not going to change. Again, we've changed multiple times over culture and over time. And I think that this reading is really good at embodying that and showing us that and proving to us that. Now, if you have more questions, we can get into any of these models differently. There are also other ideas and models of how that has changed over time, but they all really show that the main point here is that there is that change over time of what is most important and what is valued, right? And really, when we want to talk about this catalyst for change is also in here, which I think are really, really good. I think that's also a key point. Power relations, depending on what is needed in the society. So during maybe we're talking about during World War II, right? Like, so that soldier model of masculinity became very dominant. Why? Because that society was in a very big conflict, and that conflict was needed to be shown as this prominent identity and this good thing, right? Now, we're not necessarily in the same type of kind of conflict as we were in World War II. Like, we're still in conflicts in multiple places and an active conflict in multiple places. But that conflicts aren't the dominant thing that is depicted in American society right this second. Well, currently there's some of that with news about Afghanistan, but in that moment, and that again might be a reason for why we shift and change yet again to one of those models where that soldier mentality or that soldier version of masculinity becomes higher up on that hierarchy. Again, that movement depends on those power relations, depends on those things and what is needed. Also, you're going to talk about emotional relations. So that dominant ideology is going to be different for that man in that house that's trying to raise kids, right? They're not going to give a shit what you're doing with your life. They want to see who you are as a parent and what that masculinity looks like. And depending on like that context, that masculinity that you're going to need is going to be different. You're also going to talk about division of labor, how labor is distributed. Again, that businessman model is because that idea of wealth and within capitalist structure is get to the place where you have the resources that other people want, right? And that you can acquire more and more resources. And to do that, that division of labor puts you in a different place, right? And so how that's built out, what structure and hierarchical structure you have within that division of labor, and or what is the most dominant. So when coal mining was big in Kentucky, right? Being a coal miner became a more dominant ideology. It held more weight. Now, when that receded, that form of masculinity did not hold as much weight in that geographic region, right? And things like that are going to continue to bubble depending on what is there. You have in other parts of the world, you have manufacturing jobs that hold a more higher prestige. At other points in American history, that manufacturing job held a more higher prestige. So it's kind of discussing how those differences in division of labor and how those things shift and change marks differences in the models that you have. And they talk about that again here. And then the last one, again, is that symbolization, or that how media and messaging about what is masculine changes. And again, you see that all you have to do is go watch 80s action movies and watch like essentially what it was to be male mapped out in 80s action movies versus what it is to be male, and you map it out now in the wide variety of different roles that masculinity plays. Now that masculinity, hegemonic masculinity role is still going to be fairly white. It's still going to be fairly straight. It's still going to be mostly those things. Why? Because some of those things haven't shifted as much as other parts of those, right? And again, that media and that messaging behind that is important, and it dictates and impacts what masculinity becomes hegemonic or stays hegemonic, or what parts of it stay hegemonic. And I think that really anybody who's paying attention to kind of the ads or the advertisements that you watch when you're, or the pop-up during YouTube or pop-up whenever, you can even see that, like that in and of itself is a study, right? It's a social study on what is being put out there as masculine. All right. So again, this emphasizes a lot more examples. I'm just touching on the bare minimum. I want you to read it. I want you to soak in those things. If you have any questions about the categories themselves, or kind of some of the things I talk about, because I ran through it very quickly and there's a lot of information in this, please don't hesitate to reach out. Again, this is very theory intense. We want to get you thinking about how things change and why things why gender is socially constructed, and why we need to keep talking about the differences and resistance to some of those power dynamics and hierarchies within gender. So again, if you need anything, please don't hesitate to ask. Have a good day.